The Grand Deliberation Hall on Seth Prime was the most beautiful room in the known galaxy. Its walls were carved from living crystal that hummed softly with the voices of 1,000 species. Light moved through the ceiling like slow rivers of gold. Every seat was shaped to fit the body of whatever creature sat in it. It was built to show that all beings were equal, that every voice mattered, and that together they could solve anything. Kai Marin hated this room. She had spent 9 years sitting in the human section, a small block of seats near the back, because humanity was still considered young. 9 years of watching the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy talk and talk and talk while people died. 9 years of proposals that went nowhere, resolutions that meant nothing, and votes that changed nothing at all. Today was the 341st day of debate about HFY 4. HFY 4 was a small world on the edge of Council space. Its people were not members of the Council. They had no voice, no vote, no seat in this beautiful room. What they had was a plague. A parasitic organism was eating through their population at a terrifying speed. When the crisis first reached the Council's attention, 8 million people on HFY 4 were sick. Now, 11 months later, the number was 23 million. 4 million had already died. Most of them were children, because the parasite attacked smaller bodies first. Kai had read every report. She had memorized the death toll the way other diplomats memorize trade agreements. She carried those numbers with her like stones in her pockets. The reason the Council had not acted was simple. The Torvan Syndicate had placed a blockade around HFY 4. No medical ships could get through. The Torvan claimed this was a quarantine measure to protect neighboring systems. But Kai's intelligence team had found the truth months ago. The Torvan were waiting for the population to collapse, so they could buy the planet for almost nothing. HFY 4 sat on top of one of the richest mineral deposits in the sector. Dead people do not negotiate prices. Worse still, 3 council members were quietly invested in the Torvan operation. They had blocked every resolution, buried every report, and delayed every vote. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as they wanted it to. Kai stood up. The movement was small, but the hall noticed. Humans did not usually stand during open session. A few delegates turned to look. The Velthari High Arbiter, Sovelan Teth, paused his endless procedural monologue and raised one of his 4 silver eyes toward her. "The representative from Earth wishes to speak?" he asked. His voice was smooth and ancient. He had been running this council for 400 years, and he spoke to every species the same way a teacher speaks to a slow child. "I do," Kai said. She walked down to the central platform. Her boots made sharp sounds against the crystal floor. She was not a tall woman. She had dark skin, close-cut hair, and a scar along her jaw from an accident during her military service years ago. She wore the plain gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps. No decorations, no medals. She had stopped caring about those things a long time ago. She placed her datapad on the podium and looked out at the hall. Over 600 species were represented here. Some were ancient beyond human understanding. Some had technology that made Earth's best ships look like toys, and not one of them had done a single useful thing about HFY 4. 11 months ago, Kai began, her voice steady and clear, I brought evidence to this council that the Torvan Syndicate was deliberately blocking medical aid to HFY 4. I presented communication intercepts showing that the blockade was not a quarantine, but a commercial strategy. I named the 3 council members who held financial stakes in the operation. I asked for an emergency intervention. She paused. The hall was quiet now. This council voted to form a subcommittee to review the evidence. That subcommittee met once, produced no findings, and was dissolved due to scheduling conflicts. I brought the evidence again. This council voted to form a second subcommittee. That one has not met at all. She tapped her datapad. A holographic display appeared above the podium. It showed a simple number, updating in real time. 4,112,609. That is the number of people who have died on HFY 4 since I first stood in this room and asked for help, Kai said. Most of them were under the age of 10. I know this because my team has been tracking the death reports that the Torvan have been trying to suppress. She let the number hang in the air. Today, this council voted to form a third subcommittee. I watched it happen. I watched species that have existed for 100,000 years raise their appendages and vote to study the problem further, while children choke to death on a parasite that we have the medicine to treat. Her voice did not rise. She did not shout. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have gone past anger into something colder and more final. I have tried to work within this system. I have followed every rule. I have filed every motion. I have respected every protocol. And I have watched 4 million people die while this council perfected the art of doing nothing. She looked directly at High Arbiter Teth. The old Velthari stared back at her with all 4 eyes, and for just a moment, something moved behind them. Not guilt. He was too old for guilt, but perhaps recognition. Effective immediately, Kai said. Humanity withdraws from all Galactic Council diplomatic frameworks. We withdraw from the Mutual Non-Intervention Treaty. We withdraw from the Joint Defense Agreement. We withdraw from the Trade Standardization Compact. We withdraw from every agreement that requires us to sit in this room and ask permission to save lives. The hall erupted. Delegates shouted in a dozen languages. Warning lights flashed along the walls. Teth slammed his staff against the floor and called for order, but nobody listened. Kai turned off her datapad, stepped down from the podium, and walked toward the exit. Consul Dren, the Krethi-eyed diplomat who sat 3 rows from the human section, caught her eye as she passed. He said nothing, but he gave her the smallest nod, and she understood what it meant. He knew she was right. He was just too afraid to follow. She walked out of the Grand Deliberation Hall and did not look back. Outside, the sky of Seth Prime was violet and calm. Her aide was waiting with a secure communication device. Kai took it, opened a channel to the Frontier Fleet holding position in high orbit, and spoke one word to Admiral Raya Torres. Go. 1,200 kilometers above her head, the most advanced human fleet ever assembled broke formation. Navigation systems locked onto a small, dying world called HFY 4. Engines powered up, and then they were gone, cutting across the stars like a blade through silk. In the hall behind her, the shouting continued. Nobody noticed that the human seats were empty now. They would notice soon enough. Kai Marin straightened her collar, looked up at the violet sky, and allowed herself one slow breath. Then she walked to her shuttle. There was work to do, and she was done asking for permission to do it. The Torvan blockade around HFY 4 consisted of 47 warships arranged in a wide net across the planet's orbital lanes. They had been sitting there for almost a year, and in that time they had turned away over 60 aid vessels from 12 different species. Their commander, Warlord Gorvan Keth, was a thick-bodied creature with gray armor-plated skin and small black eyes that never blinked. He ran his blockade the way he ran everything, with casual cruelty and absolute confidence that nobody would challenge him. When the human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at the edge of the Ashvalan system, Gorvan was eating his midday meal. An officer brought him the sensor readings. He glanced at them between bites. 32 human warships, 8 medical carriers, 4 support vessels. Gorvan laughed. He had 47 ships, each one heavier and more heavily armed than anything the humans had brought. The humans were a young species. They had been in space for barely 3 centuries. The Torvan had been conquering systems before humans had learned to use fire. Then a transmission came through on the open channel. It was Admiral Raya Torres. Her face appeared on every screen in the Torvan fleet. She was a sharp-faced woman with silver hair pulled tight behind her head, and the kind of calm expression that experienced soldiers learned to fear. "This is Admiral Torres of the Earth Frontier Fleet," she said. "You are blockading a planet in the middle of a medical emergency. You have 1 hour to withdraw your ships. There will not be a second message." Gorvan wiped his mouth and told his communications officer to send a formal protest to the Galactic Council. That was how things worked. Humans made threats. The Council sent a strongly worded letter. He did not bother to respond directly to Torres. 59 minutes later, he wished he had. The attack, if it could even be called that, lasted 4 minutes. Human ships moved with a speed and coordination that Gorvan had never seen. They did not fire weapons in the traditional sense. Instead, they launched focused electromagnetic pulses that shut down the power systems of every Torvan warship simultaneously. Tractor beams locked onto the drifting hulls and pushed them gently out of the orbital lanes. Communications arrays were jammed with such precision that each ship could receive signals but could not send them. It was like watching someone reach into a room full of armed soldiers and quietly turn off all the lights. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single Torvan was killed. 47 warships, the pride of the Syndicate's enforcement fleet, were left floating in the dark like toys in a bathtub. Gorvan stood on the bridge of his silent, powerless flagship and stared at the view screen, which was also dead. In the darkness, he heard the distant hum of human ships passing overhead, heading toward the planet below. The medical carriers reached Ashvalan 4's surface within the hour. Dr. Lena Voss was the first human to set foot on the planet. She was a tall woman with tired eyes and steady hands, who had spent most of her career treating diseases in places the galaxy preferred to forget. She stepped out of her shuttle onto dry red soil and looked at what was waiting for her. The cities of Ashvalan 4 were mostly empty. The streets were lined with makeshift shelters made from torn fabric and broken metal. The native Ashvali were small, soft-skinned beings with large dark eyes and delicate limbs. They looked like something between a child and a bird. Thousands of them lay in rows along the roadways, too sick to move, too weak to cry out. The parasite left black marks across their skin, like cracks in dried mud. Lena had seen suffering before. She had worked plague zones on 3 different worlds. But the sight of an entire civilization lying in the dirt, abandoned by a galaxy that claimed to be civilized, hit her in a way she had not expected. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she turned to her team and started giving orders. The human medical teams worked without stopping. They set up field hospitals in every major settlement. They deployed experimental nanophage treatments, tiny machines that could enter the bloodstream and destroy the parasite from the inside. It was technology that Earth had developed for its own pandemic response decades ago, adapted now for alien biology. The first results came within 36 hours. Patients were stabilizing. Children who had been hours from death were opening their eyes. The Ashvali had never seen humans before. They watched these strange, tall creatures in white biosuits carry their sick into clean beds, inject them with medicines they did not understand, and sit beside them through the night. One Ashvali elder, barely alive herself, reached up and touched the face of a young human medic who was changing her bandages. She said something in her own language that the translator rendered simply as, "You came." The medic, a 24-year-old from a small town in Brazil, held the elder's hand and said, "We should have come sooner." Back on Seth Prime, the Galactic Council was burning. The session that followed humanity's departure was the most chaotic in living memory. Species that had been silent for decades were suddenly shouting. The Torvan ambassador demanded military retaliation. The Krethi delegation called for calm. The Malthuri representatives walked out in solidarity with Earth. High Arbiter Teth managed to restore enough order to pass an emergency resolution condemning what he called humanity's unilateral military aggression against a sovereign commercial operation. The language was careful. The intention was clear. Humanity was the villain. Ambassador Kai Marin, now operating from Earth's mobile command station aboard the carrier Resolute, watched the resolution pass with a flat expression. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. Within the hour, she authorized the release of every piece of intelligence Earth had gathered over the past 11 months. Financial records showing council members profiting from the Torvan blockade. Communication intercepts between syndicate officials and council delegates. Payment transfers, shell companies, bribery networks, all of it broadcast on every open channel in the galaxy. The Galactic Press, which had been reporting the Council's version of events, suddenly had a very different story to tell. Within a day, the phrase Ashval Papers was trending on every major communication network in known space. Citizens across dozens of worlds were reading the raw evidence of what their leaders had done, or rather, what they had chosen not to do. Secretary Illith of the Selevni delegation had been assigned the task of drafting the formal condemnation speech against humanity. She was a careful, quiet bureaucrat who had served the council faithfully for 30 years. She believed in the system. She believed in process. She had always told herself that slow progress was still progress. She sat alone in her office that night, reading the casualty projections her staff had prepared. If the council had acted when Marin first raised the alarm, over 3 million lives could have been saved. 3 million people who died waiting for a subcommittee that never met. Illith stared at the draft of her speech on the screen in front of her. Then she selected all the text and she deleted it. She sat in the quiet for a long time after that, listening to the hum of the crystal walls, and thinking about what it meant to be part of a system that worked perfectly and still managed to fail. On Ashvalan 4, the death toll had stopped climbing for the first time in 11 months. In the field hospitals, children were laughing again. The sound carried through the thin walls and out into the red dust air of a world that had been left to die. The galaxy was watching now, and what it saw was very simple. A young species, the youngest in the council, had done in 72 hours what the most advanced civilizations in existence had refused to do in a year. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because they had decided that watching people die was not something they were willing to do. 3 months after the Ashvalan incident, the galaxy looked like a mirror that someone had stepped on. The cracks were spreading in every direction, and the Galactic Council could not stop them. It started quietly. Small species, the kind that had always been ignored in the Grand Deliberation Hall, began reaching out to Earth through back channels. They did not make announcements. They did not give speeches. They simply asked if the humans were serious about doing things differently. And when the humans said yes, they asked what that would look like. What it looked like was trade ships. Human freighters began appearing in systems that had never seen them before, carrying goods and offering deals that cut out the Council's standardized tariff system entirely. For decades, the Council had controlled interstellar trade through a web of taxes and regulations that mostly benefited the larger, older species. Smaller civilizations paid more, received less, and had no real way to complain. Now, suddenly, they had an alternative. Human engineers showed up on underdeveloped worlds with tools and blueprints. They helped build water purification systems, power grids, communication networks, and orbital defense platforms. They did not ask for territory or political loyalty. They asked for friendship and fair trade. It was such a simple idea that most galactic diplomats did not know what to do with it. Chancellor Oroth Ven of the Malthari Collective was the first major leader to make a public move. The Malthari were a mid-tier civilization, not weak, but not strong enough to stand alone against the larger council powers. For generations, they had been bullied into unfavorable agreements, forced to pay inflated tariffs, and denied seats on important committees. Ven was a short, stocky being with deep green skin and a voice like gravel scraping stone. He had spent his entire political career being told to wait his turn. He was done waiting. Ven appeared on a galactic broadcast and announced that the Malthari Collective was formally withdrawing from the Galactic Council. He signed a mutual aid pact with Earth, live on camera, shook hands with Ambassador Marin, a gesture the Malthari considered deeply significant, and told the galaxy that anyone who wanted to build something better was welcome to join them. Within a week, 3 more species followed. Within a month, the number was 11. They called themselves the Free Systems Accord, and their founding document was 4 pages long. The Galactic Council's founding charter was 9,000 pages. That difference said everything. On Seth Prime, panic set in. The Council had existed for over 2,000 years. It had survived wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires. It had never faced anything like this. Not an enemy that wanted to destroy it, but an alternative that made it look useless. High Arbiter Teth held emergency sessions every day. The debates were vicious. Some delegates wanted to negotiate with the Free Systems Accord. Others wanted economic sanctions. A growing faction, led by the military powers, wanted something more direct. It was during one of these sessions that Teth made a decision he would later regret more than any other in his long life. He authorized a covert operation. The operative chosen was a Jinthari spy master, known only as Rel. The Jinthari were a species famous for their intelligence networks. They had no homeworld. They lived on ships and stations scattered across the galaxy, and they sold their services to whoever paid the most. Rel was the best of them. He had destabilized governments, manipulated elections, and arranged assassinations on 4 different worlds without ever being caught. His mission was straightforward: disrupt humanity's growing influence, create division between Earth and its new allies, make the Free Systems Accord look dangerous and unstable. Rel started with propaganda. Fake news reports appeared across the galactic networks, claiming that human aid workers were secretly installing surveillance equipment on the worlds they helped. Doctored images showed human soldiers forcing alien populations to sign loyalty oaths. Manufactured testimonies from anonymous sources described human cruelty and exploitation. Some of it worked. Fear is easy to sell, and humanity was still an unknown to most of the galaxy. Several species that had been considering joining the Accord pulled back. Trade negotiations stalled. Trust became harder to build. But Rel was not satisfied with slow results. His employers wanted something faster, something that would turn public opinion decisively against humanity. On a neutral world called Theron's Reach, a small human medical outpost served the local population. 43 aid workers, doctors, nurses, engineers, and translators lived and worked there. They had been operating for 2 months, treating injuries and illnesses that the nearest council medical facility would have charged prices the locals could never afford. On a quiet morning, a bomb destroyed the outpost. All 43 aid workers were killed. Rel's agents planted evidence linking the attack to a local insurgent group that opposed foreign presence on the planet. The galactic press reported it as a tragic example of why human intervention was unwelcome and dangerous. For 12 hours, the story held. Then human intelligence operatives tore it apart. Earth's intelligence services were not the oldest or the most sophisticated in the galaxy. But they were thorough, and they were angry. Within a day, they had traced the explosives to a Jinthari supply chain. Within 2 days, they had intercepted communications between Rel and his council handlers. Within 3 days, they had the full picture, financial transfers, operational orders, and a direct authorization bearing the seal of the High Arbiter's Emergency Committee. Admiral Torres wanted to strike back. She had known some of the aid workers personally. She sat in her command chair, aboard the Resolute, and stared at the intelligence report with eyes that could have burned holes through steel. She requested authorization to locate and destroy Rel's operational network. Marin said no. Torres argued. Marin listened. Then she said something that Torres would remember for the rest of her life. "We do not need martyrs, Raya. We need witnesses." Marin took the intelligence, all of it, unedited and unredacted, and broadcast it to every inhabited system in the galaxy. She did not add commentary. She did not make accusations. She simply showed the evidence and asked one question. "Is this what the Galactic Council calls diplomacy?" The reaction was like a wave hitting a wall. On Keth Prime, delegates who had privately approved the operation scrambled to deny involvement. Rel vanished into the dark spaces between systems, his reputation destroyed, his network exposed. The Jinthari government formally disavowed him and offered a public apology to Earth, which was the first time in recorded history that the Jinthari had apologized to anyone. But the real change happened on the streets. On Keth Prime itself, outside the Grand Deliberation Hall, a protest gathered. It started small, a few hundred citizens from local species who had followed the Ashvalen story. By the end of the day, it was thousands. By the next morning, it was tens of thousands. They came from dozens of species, many of whom had never interacted before. They held signs in their own languages. They chanted words that the Council's translation systems had never been programmed to handle, because nobody had ever expected citizens to show up at the Council's door and demand accountability. Among the crowd, a young HFY student held a banner that read, in rough but clear human English, "You buried the truth. They dug it up." High Arbiter Teth stood at his window, high above the plaza, and watched the crowd grow. He had lived for over 600 years. He had guided the Council through crises that most species had forgotten. He had always believed that stability was worth any price, that order was more important than justice, and that the system, however flawed, was better than chaos. Now he watched chaos bloom in his own courtyard, fed by the seeds his own decisions had planted. And he felt something he had not felt in 4 centuries. Fear. Not fear of the humans, not fear of the crowd. Fear that he had been wrong. Fear that the system he had spent his entire life protecting was not worth protecting at all. Fear that the galaxy was changing, and that he was standing on the wrong side of the change. Below him, the crowd kept growing. And somewhere out among the stars, humanity kept building. Not an empire, not a war machine, just a network of hands reaching out to other hands, species by species, world by world, saying the simplest and most dangerous thing anyone can say to a broken system. We can do better than this. The Galactic Council was dying, and everyone knew it. The only question was whether it would die quietly or take half the galaxy down with it. 6 months had passed since humanity's walkout, and the Council had split into 3 factions that hated each other almost as much as they feared the future. The Loyalists, led by High Arbiter Teth, still believed the old system could be saved if everyone just calmed down and followed the rules. The Reformists, led by Consul Dren of the HFY, wanted to rebuild the Council from the inside. Keep the institution, but change everything about how it worked. And then there were the militants. War Commander Fesson, of the Vorak Empire, led the militants. He was enormous, even by Vorak standards. A creature built like a small mountain, covered in dark red scales, with a voice that sounded like heavy machinery. The Vorak were one of the oldest military civilizations in the galaxy. They had fought in wars that humans had never heard of, wars that had shaped the borders of known space long before Earth's sun had planets. Thesson believed in one thing above all others. Strength was the only language the universe understood. And in his eyes, humanity's success was not a sign of moral courage. It was a sign that the galaxy had grown weak. A species that has been in space for 300 years is dictating terms to civilizations that have existed for 100,000, he said during a closed military briefing. This is not diplomacy. This is humiliation, and it ends now. Thesson assembled a coalition fleet. The Vorak provided the bulk of the ships, 400 heavy warships, each one a fortress of metal and fury. 2 allied species contributed another 200 vessels. 600 warships in total, the largest military force gathered in one place in over a century. Their target was Verath's Gate, a colony world on the edge of the Free Systems Accords territory, home to 3 million people from half a dozen species, protected by a small human advisory force. Thesson expected an easy victory. He expected to arrive, overwhelm the defenses, capture the colony, and send a message that would echo across every system in the galaxy. Humanity would learn its place. The Free Systems Accord would collapse, and the old order would be restored. He was wrong about all of it. When the Vorak coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Verath's Gate, they found something unexpected. The colony's orbital defenses were not the primitive installations that Vorak intelligence had predicted. They were new, they were advanced, and they were not entirely human. Over the past 6 months, humanity had been doing something that no galactic power had ever seriously attempted. They had been sharing their technology, not selling it, not licensing it, not trading it for political loyalty, but giving it freely to any species willing to learn how to use it. The orbital platforms above Verath's Gate had been designed by human engineers, built by Malthary construction crews, powered by Selevny energy systems, and crewed by a mixed force of 7 different species working together. Thesson opened fire. The platforms held. The battle that followed was nothing like what Thesson had planned. His fleet was larger, heavier, and carried more firepower. But the defenders of Verath's Gate fought with a coordination he had never encountered. Human tactical software linked every platform, every ship, and every ground battery into a single network that responded to threats in real time. When Thesson concentrated his attack on one section, the defenders redistributed their forces within seconds. When he tried to flank the orbital ring, small fast attack ships, crewed by species that had been considered too insignificant for the Council to notice, harassed his flanks with hit-and-run strikes that disrupted his formations. For 3 hours, 600 warships threw everything they had at a colony that was not supposed to fight back. And for 3 hours, the colony held. Then the frontier fleet arrived. Admiral Rhea Torres brought 38 ships. Compared to the Vorak coalition, it was a tiny force, but Torres had spent her entire career studying how smaller forces defeated larger ones, and she had been preparing for this moment since the day Marin walked out of the Council. She did not attack head-on. Instead, her fleet split into 4 groups and positioned themselves at the corners of the battlefield, cutting off every escape route. Then, she opened a channel to Thesson. "War Commander," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm. "Your fleet is surrounded. Your forward shields are at 40%. You have lost 11 ships, and I have lost none. I am offering you terms." Thesson snarled. "You offer terms to a Vorak war commander? You are insects." "The terms are simple," Torres continued as if he had not spoken. "Power down your weapons, turn your ships around, Go home. No prisoners, no reparations, no humiliation. Just go home and tell your people that this war is over before it starts. I will tear your fleet apart, Thesson said. You have been trying for 3 hours, Torres replied. I suggest a different approach. Thesson ordered a full assault. His ships surged forward. Torres had been waiting for exactly this. Her fleet did not engage directly. Instead, they used the same surgical precision that had disabled the Torvan blockade months ago. Focused electromagnetic pulses knocked out the command systems of the 12 largest Vorak warships, including Thesson's flagship. Tractor beams locked onto the drifting vessels and held them in place. The rest of the coalition fleet, suddenly without leadership, slowed and stopped. For a long, silent minute, nothing moved. Then, one by one, the Vorak captains began powering down their weapons. Not because Torres forced them, not because they were afraid, but because they could see, clearly and undeniably, that they had been beaten by a force 1/10 their size, and that their war commander had led them into a fight he could never win. Thesson was arrested by his own officers. He raged, he threatened, he called them cowards and traitors. They ignored him. The Vorak had a deep respect for strength, and Thesson had just demonstrated the opposite of strength. He had demonstrated stupidity, and the Vorak had no tolerance for that. The coalition fleet withdrew. Torres let them go without firing another shot. On the surface of Verit's Gate, 3 million people watched the enemy ships disappear from their sky, and the sound that rose from the colony was something between a cheer and a prayer. On Seth Prime, the news hit like an earthquake. The militant faction collapsed overnight. Species that had supported Desson's war quietly distanced themselves. The loyalists, already weakened, found themselves standing in an empty room. High Arbiter Teth sat alone in his chambers for a full day after the Battle of Verit's Gate. He did not eat. He did not speak to anyone. He simply sat and thought about the choices he had made, the covert operations, the blocked resolutions, the decades of compromise that he had told himself were necessary. Then he did something he had never done in 400 years of leadership. He picked up a communication device and called Ambassador Kai Marin directly. I would like to meet, he said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Then come to Earth, Marin replied. There was a pause. In the entire history of the Council, no High Arbiter had ever traveled to a member world for negotiations. It was always the other way around. Teth understood what she was asking. She was asking him to come as an equal, not as a ruler. Very well, he said. On Seth Prime, the reformist faction led by Consul Dren began the difficult work of reaching out to the Free Systems Accord. Dren sent his best young diplomat, a Crethi named Fen, as his personal envoy to Earth. Fen arrived expecting a fortress. She had seen the battle footage. She had read the intelligence reports. She expected a species on a war footing, cold and calculating and dangerous. What she found was a night market in Kuala Lumpur. She walked through narrow streets hung with colored lights, surrounded by humans and aliens alike. Vendors sold food she had never smelled before. Children, human children, and alien children from species she recognized from the Accord, chased each other between the stalls, laughing in languages that mixed and blended like music. A human musician played a strange stringed instrument on a corner, while a Malthari artist painted beside him, their work displayed together on a shared wall. Fen stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and confused. This was not what conquerors looked like. This was not what empires felt like. She called Dren that night from her guest quarters. Her voice was different, softer. Something had shifted behind her eyes. I think I understand now, she said. They do not want to rule the galaxy. They just refuse to let it rot. Dren was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me everything." The summit was held in New Geneva, in a building that the humans had constructed specifically for the occasion. It was not grand. It was not carved from living crystal, or lit by rivers of golden light. It was made of wood and glass and stone, materials that grew from the earth itself, and it sat on the shore of a lake that reflected the mountains behind it. The meeting room had no raised platforms, no tiered seating, no special chairs for important species. There was only a round table, large enough for every delegation, and a window that looked out over the water. Kai Marin had chosen this design herself. She wanted every delegate to understand the message before a single word was spoken. No one sits higher. No one sits lower. Everyone faces each other. They came from across the galaxy, loyalists and reformists from the Old Council, representatives from every species in the Free Systems Accord. Independent worlds that belonged to neither group, but wanted to be part of whatever happened next. In total, over 200 delegations filled the hall, and for the first time in galactic history, every single one entered through the same door. High Arbiter Savelin Teth arrived quietly. He traveled without his usual escort of guards and advisors. He wore simple robes instead of his ceremonial dress. He looked old in a way that had nothing to do with years. He looked like a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was ready to set it down. Consul Dren came with Ambassador Fen at his side. The young Krethi diplomat had spent 3 weeks on Earth before the summit, traveling from city to city, meeting humans and aliens from the Accord. She had eaten food that made her cry from the taste. She had watched a human surgeon repair the broken wing of a Selevni child and refuse payment. She had sat in a university lecture hall in Nairobi and listened to a human professor argue passionately that humanity's greatest danger was becoming the very thing it had fought against. Fen had arrived on Earth as a diplomat. She was leaving as something closer to a believer. Marin opened the summit with a question. She stood at the round table. She did not sit, because she wanted this moment to feel urgent, and looked around the room at faces and forms from 100 worlds. "What kind of galaxy do you want your children to inherit?" That was all she said. Then she sat down and let the room speak. What followed was the most difficult, exhausting, and important negotiation in galactic history. It lasted 19 days. There were shouting matches that shook the walls. There were walkouts, at least 7, by Marin's count. There were sessions that lasted until dawn, where delegates who had been enemies for centuries found themselves laughing together at 3 in the morning over cups of Earth coffee that most of them hated the taste of, but drank anyway because it kept them awake. There were tears. The Ashvali delegation, attending their first interstellar summit in their species' history, presented a list of every person who had died during the 11 months the council debated their fate. They read the names aloud. It took 4 hours. By the end, there was not a single dry eye in the room, even among species that did not have eyes in the human sense. There were moments of betrayal. A faction of loyalist delegates attempted to sabotage the summit by leaking false documents suggesting that humanity had secret military agreements with the Accord species. The forgery was exposed within hours, and the delegates responsible were removed by their own governments, who were watching the summit on live broadcast and wanted no part of the embarrassment. And there were moments of grace. On the 11th day, a territorial dispute between the Maltharai and a neighboring species called the Dravani threatened to collapse the entire negotiation. The two civilizations had been fighting over a border system for 80 years. Neither would give ground. The session descended into threats and accusations, and Marin could see the summit slipping away. It was Fen who saved it. The young Krethi stood up. She had not been scheduled to speak, and addressed both delegations directly. She spoke about what she had seen on Earth. She described the night market in Kuala Lumpur, the children playing together, the artist and the musician sharing a wall. She said that she had spent her entire life being told that different species could cooperate only through rules and threats and carefully managed self-interest. And then she had walked through a street on a strange planet and seen something she had never seen before. People choosing to be kind to each other for no reason at all. If they can do that, she said, pointing at the human delegation, then surely we can share a star system. The Malthari and Dravani delegates stared at her. Then the Malthari chancellor let out a sound that was the Malthari equivalent of a sigh, and said, "Fine, joint administration, but we get naming rights." The room laughed. The tension broke, and the summit continued. On the 15th day, High Arbiter Teth asked to address the room. He had been quiet for most of the summit, listening more than speaking, watching the negotiations with his 4 silver eyes that gave nothing away. When he stood, the hall fell silent. Whatever he was about to say, everyone understood that it carried the weight of 2,000 years. He spoke slowly. He talked about the founding of the council, about the dream of a galaxy united not by conquest, but by conversation. He talked about how that dream had been corrupted, not by any single act of evil, but by the slow, steady accumulation of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one pulling the institution a little further from its purpose. "I told myself that process was more important than outcome," he said. "I told myself that stability justified inaction. I told myself that the system would correct itself if given enough time. I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. And while I was being wrong, people died." He paused. The room waited. "The Galactic Council is dissolved," he said, "effective immediately. Not because it was destroyed from outside, but because it destroyed itself from within. What you build in its place is up to you. I only ask that you build something worthy of the lives that were lost while we did nothing." He sat down. Nobody spoke for a long time. Over the next 4 days, the delegations worked around the clock to draft the founding charter of the Galactic Compact. It was not the Council. It was something new. The charter was 47 pages long, longer than the Accord's founding document, but vastly shorter than the old Council's 9,000 pages of regulations. It established binding accountability measures for all member species. It created mandatory intervention protocols for humanitarian crises with strict timelines that could not be extended by committee vote. It set term limits on every leadership position. And for the first time in galactic history, it guaranteed direct representation for non-spacefaring species, so that no world would ever again be left to die because it did not have a seat at the table. Consul Dren was elected as the first compact coordinator. He accepted the role with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood exactly how heavy it was. Ambassador Fen was appointed senior diplomatic liaison, the youngest being to ever hold such a position. Humanity did not take a leadership role. Marin was offered several positions: coordinator, defense chair, chief mediator, and she turned them all down. When Dren asked her why, she smiled and said, "The whole point was to stop one species from running everything. That includes us." The summit ended on a clear autumn morning. The delegations filed out of the building and onto the shore of the lake. Someone, nobody could later agree on who, started clapping. Then everyone was clapping, and some were making whatever sound their species used to express hope, and the noise rolled out across the water and up into the mountains. In the months that followed, the galaxy began to change, not quickly, not perfectly, but steadily. On Ashvalan 4, a statue was raised in the central square of the largest city. It depicted Dr. Lena Voss, who had died of plague exposure 6 months after the initial mission. She had known the risk. She had stayed anyway. The statue showed her kneeling, holding the hand of an Ashvali child, and the inscription at its base was in both human English and the Ash Valley language. It read, "She came." Admiral Torres retired from the frontier fleet. She opened a small bar on Ashfallon 4, 2 blocks from the statue, and spent her evenings serving drinks to humans and aliens who came from across the sector to visit the place where everything changed. She never talked about the battles. She talked about the people. Kai Maren returned to Earth. She took a teaching position at a university in Reykjavik, where she taught political philosophy to students from 14 different species. On her first day, she stood at the front of the lecture hall and looked out at the faces, waiting for her to say something wise. A student in the third row, a young human with messy hair and nervous eyes, raised his hand and asked the question everyone wanted to ask. "Do you think humanity did the right thing?" Maren leaned against her desk. She thought about the grand deliberation hall, and the crystal walls, and the beautiful room where nothing ever changed. She thought about the 4 million names she had memorized. She thought about Lena Voss, and the Ashvali elder who had said, "You came." She thought about Fen, walking through the night market with wonder in her eyes. She thought about Teth, standing in front of the galaxy, and admitting he was wrong. "I think we did the necessary thing," she said. "History will decide if it was right. Our job is to make sure the next generation does better." The student wrote it down. Maren smiled and started her lecture. Across the galaxy, on 100 worlds, human and alien engineers worked side by side, building things that neither could have built alone. Roads and hospitals and schools and ships and futures. It was loud. It was messy. It was full of arguments and mistakes, and the kind of beautiful chaos that only happens when different people decide to trust each other. It was imperfect. It was alive. And for the first time, in a very long time, it was moving forward.